Hello and welcome to the Federal. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, and this program is called, very interestingly, it is named as Off the Beaten Track, in which we are not talking about what is making the news in this particular day or the week or this period, but actually the backstory of the headline. So today we are actually taking off on the fact that India has finally got a tribal president, and that too a lady president. So we have the first tribal woman who is the president. So it has given rise to a fair amount of conversation that this is, besides, of course, being a tactically a very wise move on part of the BJP and the Prime Minister and his colleagues within the party. But it also says that this is going to actually do wonders for the status of the tribals of the country, or the Adivasis as they are also called. Now, whether this is going to happen or not is something very important, and we will only possibly know over the next 5 years. But we definitely do have precedents to be able to guess if the president being from a particular community, does it really do anything good or beneficial for the community from where he comes from. But there is also this issue that we have a tribal president, but then what are the issues that the Adivasis of this country face? Are there any new problems which they are facing, or are they very old problems which have taken newer forms and maybe more virulent forms? So to discuss this with me, I have a very renowned sociologist, Professor Nandini Sundar, who is the professor of sociology at the Delhi School of Economics at the Delhi University. Besides, of course, also traversing the world of activism, she's also a very reputed scholar, and some of her very important books, which I'm just actually naming, which are pertaining to the subject that I'm going to be talking to her about. It's The Burning Forest, India's War in Bastar. This is her latest book, which came out in 2019, if I'm correct. Then previously, The Scheduled Tribes and Their India. And finally, we have Civil Wars in South Asia, State Sovereignty and Development, which was not a book explicitly on tribals, but it raked about a lot of issues of human interest within South Asia. So, welcome to this program, Professor Nandini Sundar. And should we begin by saying you, Aapko Johar?
Johar, Jai Johar.
Jai Johar. Let's start by understanding what is Johar. It's been talked about, but the moment after the president, after her, acceptance speech, or the first ever speech which she made after she became the president, she used that, and it suddenly got talked about, and everybody is greeting one another as Namaskar Johar, or Jai Johar, or Aapko Johar. Various forms are there which are in circulation. But you have worked with tribals for a long time. You have interacted with them. This has been part of their culture, right?
Yeah, Johar is a term that's used across Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, Odisha, as a term of greeting. So it's not there in the Northeast, certainly, but across the central Indian belt, it's a common term of welcome or hello.
Now, the first question which comes to my mind has to do with the fact that the president had declared, after she was nominated by the BJP as the NDA candidate, had said that Droupadi was not her original name, that it was Puti. And through a various chain of derivatives, it finally became Droupadi. And Murmu also came at a later point in her life. It raised certain questions about why did Puti become Droupadi. There is also this backdrop which I cannot avoid but referring to, is that last year, from the Delhi University English syllabus for the master's program, Mahashweta Devi's short story by the name Droupadi was taken out because it was found to be politically very uncomfortable for this particular government. There also the short story was about Droupadi, of a character named Droupadi, who goes through a certain very traumatic period, phase in her life. We have the president where people are saying, wow, the president is also called Draupadi. And whereas in Mahashweta Devi's short story, the complaint against her was that how can a tribal woman be named Draupadi? After all, Draupadi is a very important character. There is, in fact, an entire sequence where the policemen are inquiring as to how can a tribal woman be named after Draupadi. And the second officer says that she was actually Draupadi Mejhin, and she was born the year her mother threshed rice at Surja Sahu, one of the characters, at Bakuli, and Sahu's wife named her, which means that the right of naming a tribal girl was that of a non-tribal master where the mother was working. The first question which comes to my mind is that there is this entire issue of tribal identity. By the president who was born as and given the first name of Puti by becoming Draupadi and now sitting in the first office, would we expect at any form, in any way, a resurrection of the Puti or the original tribal identity? Is it wrong or is it right to expect something like that?
I was actually quite surprised that she mentioned it because
Yes.
it's such a common thing across Adivasi areas in central India to find that school teachers rename the children who come to their schools. So I've seen in so many cases somebody will be called Sudru, so they'll make him write Sudru Ram, or there'll be Muye or Hidme, or who will be changed to Hidme Devi or Muye Rani or something. So they always add on these kind of Hinduized suffixes so that their names become more respectable. And then as they go through school and later, then they get these standard North Indian names, right? So Masa will become Mahendra, or Paputi will become Draupadi, or Draupadi is still an uncommon name, but their names get changed. So this is a very standard process of what the Indian state has always regarded as civilizing these uncivilized groups which have these strange names and bringing them into the quote unquote mainstream. Remark upon this fact is itself, and I thought it was interesting that she reminded people that this is what happens to Adivasi children in school. Mm-hmm. And I mean, she's obviously a staunch Hindu, judging by the rituals that were performed when she took office. So it was a kind of purification or blessing, or I'm not sure what the priests were doing, but it was clearly a full-fledged purification ritual.
That's right. She also joined the Brahma Kumari order.
Yeah. So I'll come to the Brahma Kumaris later, but the fact is that the president is obviously a staunch Hindu, but noting that this is a process that happens to Adivasi children. And this came around the same time that the Pope apologized to First Nations indigenous people in Canada for the terrible treatment that they had undergone in Catholic-run hostels where many children died. They were neglected, the same kind of process. Their names were changed, their identities were attacked, they were not allowed to speak their own languages, they were separated from their families. We've also had this history of Australian Aboriginal children suffering these terrible histories of separation and identity loss. So in India, it hasn't been as bad in the sense that children have not been fully separated from their parents, but we do see a process where both historically and increasingly now, the government is setting up these large hostels. So for instance, in Bastar, you have 1,000-seater porta cabins where small children are brought and there are no primary schools in the villages. One of the things the BJP government has done, in fact, recently in the last year is to shut down all the small schools that existed, single teacher schools in different villages, and centralized the primary schools. So this effectively means that small children are being separated from their parents and put into these hostels where their identity changes. They are taken away from their own culture and put into a different culture. And
Right.
in many cases, we do see that they are punished for speaking their own languages. There is a heavy emphasis on learning Hindi, in Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, um, Jharkhand, etc., rather than learning their own languages. And there is definitely a process of cultural alienation that goes on.
Mhm. We are at the moment, at the cusp of completing 75 years of India's independence. A lot has been said by the government. Every day, there is some statement or the other about the democratic values of the nation, and which the state keeps on saying that we believe in it. But do you think that there is a fundamental disconnect between the ideals which the state has historically, said and said that they believe in, and what actually reaches out to the tribal or the Adivasis, and how they actually encounter the state? You talk about the childhood as how they get separated, but even after that they grow up, they keep on encountering the state in various forms, which possibly is not the same kind of ideals and the values which the state keeps on talking about.
I mean, the ideals and values of the Constitution seem to disappear when it comes to Adivasi areas, and that has historically been a problem. If you look at the whole, I mean, at some level, this is common to everybody in India. If you look at the whole judicial system, the justice system, right? It's in an alien language. The whole IPC, CRP, CR codes, which are only kind of known by lawyers, they're not accessible to the public. So as a whole, the judicial system is something that is alien and imposed on large majorities of people.
Right.
But when it comes to Adivasi areas, it's even worse because, they don't even speak the language of, they don't speak Hindi or Odia or whatever other state languages that exist. They have their own languages. There's no communication. They have you have to pay huge money. I mean, that applies everywhere. You have to pay money to lawyers. And the percentage of Adivasis who are under trials in jail is much higher than their proportion in the population. That actually applies to Muslims and Dalits.
That's right.
These are three communities which are overrepresented among under trials in jail.
That's
and
right.
Compared to their representation, say, in class 1 jobs or, the positive benefits that the state provides. So there's that. The schooling system is alien, the judicial system is alien, and there's a massive takeover of Adivasi resources. Historically, we have basically treated Adivasi areas as internal colonies.
That's right.
So the resources that come from those areas are far in excess of the funds that are spent on those areas. And, one could go on field by field and look at the way their forest rights have been taken away, their land titles have not been recognized. The sheer kind of contempt with which Adivasis are often treated by other sections of the population is something really sad.
When I spoke to you first about this conversation, I had, then made up my mind that I'm going to share an experience which I had very early in my, journalistic career, sometime in the early 80s. At that time, in one of my long visits across Madhya Pradesh, I had also traveled to the district of Jhabua, where I learned about this gentleman called Mama Baleshwar Dayal, who was living there among the tribals. He had married a Bhil woman, and he was staying there. He had also been a member of parliament at some point. He was an old socialist. But nonetheless, just to understand the tribal issues straight out of JNU, trying to understand where does India stand. So some few things came out, which I do remember. And I made a list of the kind of issues which I listed, that what were those that the tribals were grappling all the time. There was, of course, the loss of control over the natural resources. I actually listed it down for me, just from my memory. Lack of education was something that came across very, very strongly. I would had a few conversations even with his wife. Displacement and rehabilitation, that is the time when it had already started in a big way. There was also some problem in Jhabua at that particular point. They faced acute problem of health and nutrition. Mind you, I'm talking about in India 40 years back, which was possibly 40 times worse than what it is now in the tribal areas. And now also it is not very good. Gender issues, both within the family and also of the non-tribal population, sexually exploiting the tribal women. And of course, there was this basic issue which we talked about when you were telling us about the president's name, the erosion of the tribal identity, when you were also mentioning as to how the children are taken away. It comes as a very painful realization that possibly in the 4 decades, very little has changed. Or am I just overreacting that no, there has been some change?
I'm not sure that the change has been entirely positive. So there has been some change, but it's not as with the rest of the population. You see that life expectancy has gone up, and various other indicators have also improved, right? You do have certain very vulnerable small Adivasi groups which have become more endangered. Their languages have become more endangered. Their resource base has become much more endangered. Also, as people have been displaced, so 1 in every 4 Adivasi families has been displaced. And, Walter Fernandez had these figures of
Yes.
Of the people who have been displaced, 40% are Adivasis. So it's like a major impact on this section of people. So as people lose their resources, then their condition actually goes down rather than in actual health and nutrition terms. So if you look at the change in crop patterns from millets to rice, one would have to do a much more micro detailed historical study to see,
right,
in nutritional terms, in health terms, what has changed, what has not changed, whether it's been positive, negative, entirely. I mean, there have been changes for the better as well. And if you look at, say, forest rights, right? Historically, people have fought. Adivasi communities haven't just been victims, they've been struggling for their rights. They've been maintaining their culture, traditions, language in the face of terrible odds. So historically, when the British started reserving forests, people struggled. There was the Santhal Hul, there was the Bastar Bhumkal, there were rebellions all over the place. And they did get some rights or concessions from this colonial government. For instance, the right to use local forests for their own firewood, etc. Over a period of time, some of these forests then became reserved. And one of the major recent victories for the Adivasi community has been the Forest Rights Act of 2006, the Scheduled Tribes and Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act, which recognized that people were not encroachers necessarily in their own land. They had been living there for many generations, farming there for many generations, but it was the state which had not put its own record keeping in order and recognized those lands as belonging to these communities or to these families. So that was one aspect of the Forest Rights Act. The other aspect was the recognition of community forest rights. So in many places, communities have been protecting their local forests, and in many villages, like across Jharkhand, Odisha, I mean, you find this also in Karnataka, people have sacred groves, which are repositories of biodiversity. So nobody will cut those, that particular, sacred grove. So they also, under that act, got the right to manage their own community forests, howsoever defined, their boundaries were to be defined through a consultative local process. But what's happened right now, just about the time that the president was declared, the government changed the forest conservation rules. So now you no longer have to ask the community for permission to divert their land to an industry or a mine. That process has been left to the state government, but before that, the central government can take money in lieu of that land and assign that land to the developer. So once the government, it's like saying, you know, if one member of the family has accepted money for, like you own a motorcycle, like the family owns a motorcycle, one member of the family mother has accepted money for the motorcycle, then even if it's the child's motorcycle, the child can't really say, no, I'm not going to sell my motorcycle because the mother has already taken the money.
Yes.
And
so it's the same thing is going to happen with the forest
exactly
land.
So once the central government has taken the money and said, okay, whatever, then it becomes a fait accompli for the local community, right? So it's taken away all their rights under the Forest Rights Act. So it's a really, really big assault on a hard-won victory. And it happened exactly at the same time as they declared an Adivasi woman president.
Now, there is something about, the tribal or the Adivasi community, especially in central India, Chhattisgarh, parts of Jharkhand, Odisha, the non-tribal, the city dwellers hear only about the tribals as being the inhabitants of the places where there's the worst internal security violence in the country, especially left-wing extremism, Maoism, various names and labels are put. You also had the Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, saying, that it was the biggest internal security threat to the country. There is a political problem. There is actually a tremendous amount of resentment. What do you think really lies at the base of it? We on the other hand, we see that even this government has, you were referring to the tribal uprisings, the protest movements, they keep on being romanticized. The Santhal uprising is romanticized by even the BJP and the RSS all the time. Yet when it comes to the contemporary issues, they virtually end up doing the same things which the British were doing at that time.
Exactly.
So what is the political base?
People, Sidhu and Kanu or Birsa Munda or Gundadhur or any of these leaders were fighting for the same things as people are fighting for today, Jal Jangal Jameen, rights over their own resources. And yet, they are now being treated as freedom fighters, and these people are being treated as Naxalites and terrorists and being killed. So, there's clear hypocrisy and double standards in the whole approach to this way of understanding Adivasi issues. The second is that if you look at the Naxalite movement, it clearly had different roots in different states, different causes. So, for instance, Bihar, it was mostly among Dalits, fighting for better wages.
A lot of caste violence there.
Caste violence, etc. In Bastar, it's been mostly about gaining control over the forest, keeping out the patwari or the forest guard who were making money from people, redistributing land, and also now keeping out mines. So the major reason why people want to join them is because they feel that they need to protect their land from outside. The Maoists have also done a lot of work in terms of land distribution, like from richer families, they've redistributed it among others in the village. So there's a whole system that a whole couple of generations have grown up with, where they collectively farm, they store grain, they build ponds together, etc., which you can't really eradicate it just with force, right? It's not, yes, there is all the kind of ambushing, the landmines, etc., but the state government response is so completely misconceived, because we're talking about a question of rights, resources, and then you start attacking people, through something like Salvajadom, burning villages, killing people. Where is the match between what people want and how the state is responding to them? And it's not as if in non-Maoist areas they're getting great resources or anything, so that cannot be the reason. Like, in fact, the only reason why the government is providing resources now to Bastar is to sort of wean them away from Maoism. Nothing, all these years, what did they do?
There's something, extremely ironical, I have found it, that despite what you are saying is the reality of what the tribal community is up against and the role of the state and the political parties, we do find that the Bharatiya Janata Party doing extremely well in certain tribal areas. I've also found it extremely, important to point out, that the first affiliate which was established by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh way back in the 1950s was to work among the tribals to induct them, co-opt them into the Hindu community. And it was ironically named as Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram. Now, calling them Vanvasi, what does it show? That's point number one. And then why, despite wanting to, going back to where we started, Draupadi, Puti becoming Draupadi, taking them into the Hindu fold, continuing with persecution and denying basic rights to the tribal community, yet there is electoral support for the BJP. How do you explain, or do you have any clues about how to read the situation?
So the distinction that the RSS makes is between Shehervasi, Gaonvasi, and Vanvasi. But it's not like you have a Gaonvasi Kalyan Ashram or a
Shehervasi Kalyan
Kalyan. So clearly,
so Kalyan is only for the Vanvasi.
For the Vanvasis, and there is that definite, element that they have to be civilized, Hinduized, taught Sanskrit, taught Hindu prayers, etc. But if you look at the reason why the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram was set up in 1948 in Jashpur, Catholics were very strong in Jashpur and that belt, right? So
that's right. They wanted to counter Christian.
If you look at wherever the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram centers have come up, they have always come up in proximity to a Catholic institution. So it's not so much. It is also about drawing the Adivasis into the Hindu fold, but it is also about countering the Christians.
And this has worked, that they have been able to give tribals a sense of being part of a larger Hindu whole. What's your
yes, it has. I mean, if you look at, the fact that they have all these Saraswati Shishu Mandirs, they have the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, where, there's a book by Tariq Tachil which shows the kind of overlap between these NGO fronts of the RSS and the electoral support. So they clearly bring them into a kind of electoral umbrella for the BJP. Because if there's no other service that the state is providing, it becomes easier to, establish oneself as as a benevolent body. And if you look at the kind of, I've done some research on the Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, they are inclusive. People do feel a sense of pride in being a large part of the organization, but they do sort of subtly promote hate against other religions, support for the BJP, support for the RSS, and the kind of training that they get is very much within that RSS mold. Established Catholic institutions also face a problem from the evangelicals who are poaching, but so there's this huge competitive proselytization that's going on from the RSS and a little bit from the evangelical.
And you see
and the
this
Catholics
continuing.
are just sort of sitting back now.
So coming to my last question, that invariable question, the road ahead, 5 years of a tribal presidency, 5 years with a lot of history of nothing really having changed. What can be done? How does the civil society engage besides what it has been doing all the past years?
Well, civil society has to engage first by saving this country's constitution. There is no constitution, no Adivasi, nobody's going to be,
not
able
just
to
the Adivasi, but every community.
Every citizen is under threat right now, right? Adivasis are more a threat as they have always been, because of their resources being targeted. But, for instance, let's take these recent judgments by the Supreme Court, the Zakia Jafri judgment and the Himanshu Kumar judgment. In the Chhattisgarh case, this was a major massacre in 2009. 9 people in one village, 5 people in another village, 6 people in surrounding villages, all on the same day. So again, the police say we didn't do it, and the court says, okay, you didn't do it, fine. So then they are wrong. Why should they? By challenging them, challenging the police, you're upsetting national
True.
security. So
So
everybody
it's
is under
actually
the same kind of threat.
everybody is under threat. The tribals more so, because they have possibly faced a greater amount of persecution and alienation over the last 75 years that India has been independent. And even before that, there is a history of subjugation of the tribal and the Adivasi community.
Yeah, and also
Thank
the
you.
Congress. I'm sorry, I have to bring in Manmohan Singh saying that the
Yes.
Maoists are the biggest threat.
Yes.
The Salva Judum was a joint operation of the Congress and the BJP,
right.
and hundreds of people were killed, and nothing has happened. No, thousands.
True.
I mean, 5,000 by official figures, and many more
by
local figures, and nothing.
So
I mean, it's okay to kill. You call yourself secular, then what about caring about Adivasi lives? The BJP's policies are increasingly anti-Adivasi in the way that resources are being handed over to a few favored crony capitalists, and these attacks on forest rights and language and identity issues. But it's not as if the UPA government really cared, because if you look at their record, it was quite mixed. On the one hand, they passed the Manrega, the Forest Rights Act, RTI. All of these have been very beneficial to the land acquisition changes, which made social impact assessment necessary. So all these have definitely benefited Adivasis, their pro-Adivasi legislations. But at the same time, when Manmohan Singh called Maoists the biggest security challenge to India, and the central government, which was then run by the Congress, collaborated with the Chhattisgarh government run by the BJP to start Salva Judum and to keep it going, which resulted in massive devastation to villages. People were killed, houses were burnt, women were raped. It was really, really horrible. It was,
True.
something like 2002 Gujarat,
True.
going on and on and on. And they... you can't really be secular with saying that we believe in the rights of one religion and not believe in the rights of
the other
kinds of minorities. So
right.
Not that they're very secular in defending anybody's rights necessarily, but certainly, they're not. I mean, it's not like an all-out attack on the constitution the way the BJP is doing.
True.
But really, Adivasis have not had a fair deal from any government, or from any party except for the left. I think the left is the only, both the CPIM, CPM have worked among Adivasi communities.
And unfortunately, the left is of very little electoral consequence in the country now. Thank you very much. On this rather depressing note, it is time for me to wind up this conversation. We, of course, are aware that history does not really give us much hope. But let's come back after a few years and see whether having a tribal president in any way has helped the community. We don't really see much reason for hope, but then again, we must keep on hoping against hope. Thank you very much, Nandini Sundar, for coming and being part of the show.
Thank you.